Now, if you are a Terran player, you're probably really going to like this video. But if you play Protoss or Zerg, you might want to get yourselves like a drink or maybe a box of tissues or whatever you need when you're sad. Because today we're gonna read through the balance update that recently has been added to StarCraft 2. Now, obviously, this is for the balance test map. I already made a really long video about all of the changes that Blizzard initially announced about a week and a half or so ago. These changes today are gonna be in addition to the changes that have already been made. So if you missed that video, I'll go ahead and post a link to it down below in the description of this one, because today we're gonna jump into the additional changes instead. Now, I have been playing the balance test map as much as I possibly can, so I can properly give you my thoughts on all of the changes for all three races. If you've been watching the live stream, you know that I've been trying a wide variety of strategies, from like battle cruiser proxies to like Tempest shield battery rushes to all kinds of swarm host Nydus Network plays. So I've been trying out all the changes as much as I can, but today we're gonna look at the additional changes that Blizzard has added to the multiplayer version of the test map. Earlier this month, we announced our post-BlizzCon design patch containing changes aimed at improving StarCraft 2's multiplayer. Around the same time, members of the balance team were in Montreal to solicit feedback from top players in the World Championship Series circuit. Based on the feedback we received from the community as well as pro players, we decided to expand the scope of our initial balance proposal. Below is a rundown. So let's have a look. If you're a big fan of the playstyle that Haas likes to play, the one where he essentially proxies all kinds of buildings on the other side of the map, including but not limited to robotic facilities, warp prisms, immortals, photon cannons, shield batteries, and he does this really aggressive push from the opposing player's natural, you're probably gonna be a little bit disappointed, because that strategy is being nerfed quite hard. PROTOSS, the shield battery. Health and shield decreased from 200 respectively to 150. We've been monitoring proxy shield battery strategies over the last few months, and while we don't believe they're unbeatable, we would like to make this strategy slightly more risky. Reducing their total health pool targets weakening offensive usage while mostly maintaining their defensive power. Specifically, this will reduce the number of corrosive biles it takes to destroy them from 7 to 5. Which should provide Zerg players a clearer response to this strategy. So this is very, very specifically meant to counter that Haas kind of playstyle, where you proxy not only photon cannons, but also shield batteries, then of course the robotics facility, and then eventually into the immortals as well as the warp prism. Now the thing is, with the changes made to Protoss previously, like for example, the cheaper robotics facility, this strategy all of a sudden was a whole lot stronger, because essentially you could get yourself like, I think like a third or like half a photon cannon extra because of the cost reduction of the robotics facility, which doesn't sound like a big deal, but it actually helps Protoss quite a bit with this strategy. So what they've decided to do is make it so that the shield batteries are a little bit easier to kill. Now at the pro level of play, the most common strategy to countering that playstyle from Protoss is to go for really quick Ravagers. Usually get about like 5 to 6 to 7 or so. Use the Queens for tanking and then the Ravagers in the back to rain corrosive biles, ideally on 2 buildings or so at once. And then to eventually just simply break the Protoss before they can really get those Immortals out and before they can really get the Warp Prism or whatnot going. Now, with the change previously, it was very difficult to do so just because Protoss could go ahead and get themselves like an additional half photon cannon, which obviously doesn't really work like that, but you get what I'm trying to say. They were able to play just a little bit more defensively, and it made it so that the response with the Ravagers was not nearly as viable. Right now, you are still mostly going to be able to do the same strategy. However, it's going to be critical for Protoss players to steal the second gas inside of the Zerg's main base. So while the strategy that Haas likes to play is definitely still viable, it's going to be just a little bit weaker. And that's also because of this second change over here to the Warp Prism. Pickup range decreased from 6 to 5. Warp Prisms received a ranged pickup in Legacy of the Void, and for the most part we enjoy how it worked out so far. Top Protoss players are able to show off their micro abilities, and it helps promote multi-pronged offensive options. One area we feel we could see some improvement on is the ability for Zerg players to ward off Warp Prism Archon openers. Currently, the combined range of the Warp Prism pickup and the Archon is 9, which outranges the Queen anti-air attack by 1. We'd like to reduce pickup range by 1 to allow Queens to interact more meaningfully with the Warp Prism play. We believe this change could help open up many different potential Zerg openers, but we're also mindful of the fact that Protoss players rely heavily on the Warp Prism based tactics. Thus, we'll be keeping on, we will be keeping an especially close eye out on this change. This is a rather big one. It doesn't sound very significant, but it is going to be much easier for Zerg players to deal with Warp Prism aggression. Now, obviously, it's only really meant for the juggling of all of the Protoss units, what Protoss players have been doing a lot more over the last couple of months. Obviously, it's still going to be great for just, you know, a unit to warp in other units from. But if you want to juggle your units, like, for example, Archons, but also Immortals, obviously, in that proxy aggression, it's going to be just a little bit harder to do, and you're going to have to play just a little bit more aggressively with the Warp Prism, putting it in range of where the Queens can actually hit. So this is an interesting change. I'm not entirely sure how this one is going to play out. I did do a little bit of Warp Prism play over at the live stream to try out how these changes work out. It doesn't seem a significant difference. You can still pick up your units from quite a large difference, but it is going to make it just a little bit easier for Zerg players in particular to defend against that kind of strategy. I don't think it's really going to affect Protoss versus Protoss. Well, obviously, Protoss versus Protoss is not going to be that relevant anyway. You do see some pickup micro every once in a while, obviously, particular with like Disruptors and Immortals and all that, but I don't think it's really going to affect that all too much, because units are going to have a hard time hitting the Warp Prism there anyway. In the Terran versus Protoss matchup, I don't think it's really going to affect that one very much either. This is really specifically meant to change how the Zerg versus Protoss matchup works. And I personally, maybe I'm a little biased because I do like playing Zerg the most myself. I've been playing Zerg for like 8 years at this point. I also do play the other races, of course, at a high level. But I personally don't mind this. It's a nice quality of life change. Personally, I don't really like it when a unit is like a jack of all trades. And I've said it several times before, I genuinely think that the Warp Prism is the strongest Protoss unit. As weird as that sounds, it's either the High Templar or the Warp Prism. Both are absolutely phenomenal. And I think this just makes the Warp Prism a little bit weaker. It might mean, though, that Protoss is going to need some other buffs in other areas, but this is definitely going to be a interesting change. It's gonna make it much easier, at the very least, at lower level of play, because basically, if you're going up against, like, Archon drops at lower level, just get, like, your 5 Queens out or whatever, and just attack the Warp Prism, and there's a good chance your opponent is going to overextend, whereas I feel like at the pro level, it's not going to make that big of a difference. Now, there's a nice little buff here as well. This is going to help out, at particular, the lowest level of play. We have Prismatic Alignment. Earlier in Legacy of the Void, we added a speed reduction to Prismatic Alignment to prevent Void Rays from overly punishing enemies fighting them. While we're still satisfied with the direction we took with this change, we believe that we could achieve similar results by toning the speed reduction back a bit. So Prismatic Alignment speed reduction decreased from 40% to 25%. So obviously Void Rays have an ability called Prismatic Alignment. If you activate it, they deal bonus damage against armored units. They deal significantly more damage so. Now, currently, if Prismatic Alignment is activated, the unit is very slow on the ladder. However, in the balanced test map, they are going to be a little bit slower, but 40% to 25% is a very noticeable difference. You're actually going to be able to use them once again. Kind of, right? If for example, enemy units are trying to run away, and take the fight elsewhere, they're going to have to run quite a bit further away, which obviously allows you to chase down and whatnot quite a little bit better. Void Rays right now, I think at the pro level, which is obviously what the game is balanced around, they're very uncommon. I personally think that both Phoenixes as well as Oracles are vastly superior to Void Rays, but at the lower level of play, obviously both Phoenixes as well as Oracles require a lot of micro. Void Rays are very strong, and I think that this is going to make it just a little bit easier to pull them off. By the way, for those of you wondering, Loko, how the heck do I counter Mass Void Ray? Well, you kill Mass Void Ray by not allowing Protoss to get there in the first place? I've had this question several times yesterday at the live stream. Like, Lowko, how the heck do you counter Void Rays to begin with? Well, if you play 4v4 and one guy is sitting in the corner of the map and he's making 50 Void Rays, the issue is not so much that the 50 Void Rays are hard to beat, it's that you shouldn't really allow him to get 50 Void Rays anyway, because that's taking like 20 minutes. Anyways, that's just a little bit of a sidestep right there. But I think this is a nice quality of life improvement, in particular for 1 versus 1. It might very well make Void Ray openers once again a little bit more viable. They're very uncommon these days, but it would be interesting to see how it plays out. Now, as it is right now, in the current version of the balanced test map, the vast majority of Protoss Stargate openers are going to be with Tempests. Tempests are very interesting. They are much better than they ever were. I'm going to have to make a separate video on that if they are going to stay in the way that they are right now. Currently on the ladder in StarCraft 2, like in the live version of the game, Tempests really are a very much a niche unit. In the balanced test map, they are absolutely phenomenal. Excuse me. They're absolutely phenomenal. They're really, really strong. Now, that once again is also due to the fact that people don't just proxy the Stargates, they also actually proxy shield batteries. So I wonder how this is going to play out in that kind of strategy as well. Overall, I gotta say, I'm a big fan of the Protoss changes right here. And I think that while the Warp Prism pickup may be just a little bit too much, I'm curious to see how it's going to play out. It's all relatively minor, but it can definitely have, massive outcome, in particular at the top level of play. All right, let's have a look at the Zerg. There's a couple of changes to Zerg that are gonna fundamentally change the way that Zerg is played. First off, we have the Queen. Transfusion will no longer instantly heal 125 health. Instead, it will instantly heal 75 health and then heal 50 additional health over 7 seconds. For Zerg early game, Queens are integral when dealing with light harass and frontal pushes. They also provide a lot of utility with creep spread and their ability to inject larva. We think Queens might be a bit too catch-all of a unit right now, so we'd like to weaken one of these roles. With this change, the heal over time portion of the heal will no longer stack, weakening the effectiveness of chaining transfusions on high HP units such as other Queens. Our goal with this change is to push players towards building combat units when facing dedicated aggression, while maintaining the Queen's strength against light harass. Additionally, this reduces the late game power of Queens by lowering the efficiency of rapid transfusions on units like Ultralisks and Brute Lords. And by the way, I love this. Whenever Blizzard writes dedicated aggression, they mean cheese. That's basically what it comes down to. I always like that wording, dedicated aggression. Okay, so this right here is a fundamental change. Now, Queens are going to be able to burst heal with 75 health still, but it's a relatively big change. For those of you curious, the way that it works, say if you want to hit 20 transfuses on one Ultralisk, right? You're going to get the 75 health 20 times. However, the heal over time effect will only apply once, which means that in the late game, if you're pushing with, say, Ultralisks and Brute Lords, as well as a bunch of Queens, the Queens are going to have to sort of like transfuse really quickly, but not necessarily on the same unit twice. So the times of having a hero Ultralisk are gonna be much, much more difficult, just because the rapid fire it's just gonna waste a lot of energy, you know what I mean? It's not gonna be nearly as efficient. So the heal over time effect does not stack. You can still burst heal for 75 health each. In the early game though, like Blizzard says right here, the transfusions on other Queens is a pretty big deal, right? Usually Zerg, in particular in the Terran versus Zerg matchup, they will make like up to 20 Queens. Okay, maybe that's a little excessive, but in a lot of the games, people will go up to 8 Queens and basically defend pretty much everything that Terran has. Usually we see like a small group of Zerglings that can be morphed into Banelings or maybe a couple of Roaches. But really those are the units that Zerg relies on in the early game of Zerg versus Terran in particular, but also in Zerg versus Protoss. You see players now adding on more and more Queens the longer that the game goes on, just because of their utility, right? However, as I mentioned with the Warp Prism, I definitely agree that Queens are too well-rounded. When it comes to best Zerg units, I just mentioned my favorite Protoss units, or what at the very least I consider to be the strongest Protoss units. I think Queens are by far the strongest Zerg unit. They are absolutely phenomenal, and they are most definitely catch-all. I think overall, it makes sense to make them a little bit weaker. just because, you know, forcing players to make units is not a bad idea, plus it makes a lot of sense. And I think this is a nice, elegant change to make it so that Zerg has to just be a little bit more on their tiptoes, and they can't just continue droning if they see like 15 Marines moving across the map or whatever. They're actually gonna have to have like not only like, you know, 6 queens out, but probably also like 30 Zerglings at the very least, right? Which is what you kind of get right now, but you might want to just get yourself a couple more links just in case. I think it makes sense. I think it makes a lot of sense. This is really good. All right, now the next one is another one of those very, very fundamental changes to Zerg. We have a creep nerf. Building creep tumor generation, or building/creep tumor creep generation. Time between creep growth period increased from 0.3 to 0.45, as well as the overlord generate creep. Time between creep growth period increased from 0.36 to 0.45. In the transition from Heart of the Swarm to Legacy of the Void, the creep growth period was cut in half, from 0.6 to 0.3, to account for other changes made during that period. While this doesn't practically translate into creep spreading twice as fast, it has certainly had an effect on Zerg players' ability to control the map. More recently, after much refinement on the part of Zerg players, we began receiving feedback that creep spread might be too oppressive, allowing Zerg to control large portions of the map, leading into the mid to late game. To help mitigate this, we'd like to experiment with creep spread rate, initially by adjusting the rate that's halfway between the current live value and the value from Heart of the Swarm. As creep spread is core to Zerg identity, we'll be paying close attention to the results of this change. Now this is massive, in particular in the Zerg versus Terran and the Zerg versus Protoss matchups. When I first read it, it really felt like they were gonna make the speed significantly slower. In my personal testing, though, it doesn't seem to be, you know, nearly as influential or as impactful as it says right here. It's still a big deal, but if you're not playing Zerg absolutely perfectly or close to perfectly in the early game, you are not really gonna notice the creep spread change that quickly. Personally, I found myself spreading creep about as often, but there is a slight difference in speed at which it spreads around. And it is something you notice if you pay close attention to it. But if you occasionally, right, say you go on the ladder and you put down some tumors and occasionally you look back and you spread them, it's not really going to change anything. This is really going to affect probably, you know, the top 100 Zerg players on the planet more so than anyone else, just because they will continuously be on top of their creep tumor placement and the way they're going to spread the tumors around and the amount of queens that they have dedicated to it. It is going to make things noticeably slower, but not to a point where it's all of a sudden going to be unplayable. I was a little bit worried here initially that it was going to be very slow once again, to the point where Zerg could no longer really rely on having that creep out at a certain point in the map. Or a certain point in the game on the map. I think that might still be true, and maybe the number has to be scaled back a little bit, but it's not gonna be as impactful as it reads right here. It really feels like they're going for a heavy nerf here, and while it is definitely noticeable, it's not gonna change the game very much so. So I'm a little bit on the brink on this one. Personally, I feel like this is true at maybe the top level play. But the thing is, all of the top level players that go up against these top level Zergs are also really good at denying the creep. So I don't really see a lot of like top level Terran players having a lot of issues with dealing with the Zerg creep spread if they go bio, or a lot of Protoss players, they're really good at containing the creep spread as well. I personally like the interactions between the queens and then, like, for example, a group of Marines clearing out the creep, and then like 2 dedicated queens once again come back to spread creep all over the area. I'm not entirely sure if I agree with the reasoning right here by Blizzard, but you know, it's a test mode, right? If they want to test these kind of changes, right now is the time. And while I personally don't necessarily know if it's necessary, I guess, I see where they're coming from, and I'm glad they're at the very least giving it a try, you know, and see how it plays out. This is gonna need a lot more practice though. I definitely want to play the balanced test map a lot more to see exactly how I feel about this after a couple of days. As it is right now, I feel like it's impactful, but it's not gonna be as big of a deal as, for example, the queen health reduction right there, or rather the heal reduction right there on the transfusion. By the way, as far as the queen transfusions go, some people pointed out maybe this is going to even be a buff in some scenarios, because sometimes queens overheal, which is interesting. I kind of like that idea, just to backstep a little bit. Or to step back just a little bit. I've seen this happen several times in like Zerg vs Zerg, where you are being the defensive player and you get some transfuses off on your Roaches, and obviously Roaches don't have a lot of HP, so the heal over time can technically help out. The thing is, 7.14 seconds is a really long time in StarCraft terms. This is like longer than most engagements take, so I don't really see this being as big of a deal as some people making it out to be. I think this is a most definite nerf. Alright, now we have a nice quality of life change. We have the Roach. Tunneling claw cost decreased from 150 to 100. Tunneling claws no longer increases the health regeneration of burrowed roaches from 7 HP a second to 14 HP a second. So tunneling claws is the ability for the roaches to be able to burrow on the ground and then move around. This is something that we see a lot right now in the Zerg vs Zerg matchup, and I'm personally a big fan of it. I never really liked the idea that they could heal much more aggressively while burrowed with the tunneling claws upgrade. So I personally actually really like this, because sometimes I find myself having a hard time justifying not only obviously the cost of the tunneling claws upgrade, but also the burrow upgrade that you have to get at the hatchery. So I personally actually really like this slight cost reduction, because it's going to make it much easier to actually play around with tunneling claws. In the Zerg vs Zerg matchup, we see a lot of tunneling claws roaches used to harass mineral lines. While we enjoy both the harass and the comeback potential that this ability affords Zerg players, we've received a lot of feedback from Zerg players that it might be good, or it might be too good rather, in this role. Because of the high health regeneration with the tunneling claws upgrade, it can take over twice the number of defensive roaches to dislodge harassing roaches. In other matchups, tunneling claws is not seen nearly as much, and when it is used, the moving while burrowed functionality is more valued over the additional health regeneration. This set of changes is aimed towards slightly tuning down roach harass in mirror matchups while increasing its potency in other matchups. Well, I don't know about increasing the potency in other matchups. I don't really see anyone really playing burrowed roaches against the other players. The Terran players and the Protoss players, that is, necessarily very much, but I do like this a lot for the Zerg vs Zerg, just in general. Basically, what that means is, what they mean, by the way, with this additional heal is that, as it is right now in ZVZ, if you see your opponent doing like a 4 roach run by, you're gonna have to send like 7 or 8 roaches to properly deal with it, because if burrowed microed properly, they can actually stay alive for a really long time, and it's very difficult to actually deal with. So this is going to make it much easier for, say, 5 roaches to pick off a group of 4 burrowed roaches. You can at the very least send yourself like a similarly sized army rather than something that's much bigger to deal with the tunneling clawed roaches of your opponent. So I like this change a lot. I think it's a really good quality of life improvement that's definitely going to help out, in particular, Zerg versus Zerg. Now we have one over here for the Hydralisk. That is a bit of a debatable one. Health increased from 85 to 90. So in the previous patch, by the way, we saw the Hydralisk getting a health reduction from 90 to 85. So 90 HP is what they currently have in StarCraft 2. So they are once again at 90 HP. However, the Needle Spine's weapon speed changed from 0.54 to 0.57. We received feedback from players of all races at Montreal that they'd rather see an attack speed nerf to Hydralisks as opposed to a health nerf. By reducing attack speed instead of health, we can reduce how deadly the Hydralisk is in large armies, making it less of an all-round unit, while still maintaining its ability to fight units like Oracles cost effectively. Maintaining the higher health also allows Hydralisk to have more of a back-and-forth interaction with threats like Psionic Storm. So I personally found myself losing a lot more Hydralisk in the test map of StarCraft. It's not so much that 5 HP is a lot, it's just significant on a unit that already is low in HP. Basically, this change is gonna give the Hydralisk like about a 5% attack speed reduction, which definitely is substantial, but it's gonna be less glass cannony and more reliable, which I personally don't mind whatsoever. I agree that right now in the 1 vs 1 live version of the game, the Hydra is just a little bit too all-round. I mean, Hydraling Bane is the gold standard in TVZ as well as in PVZ, so I do not mind that the Hydra is getting nerfed just a little bit. And maybe this change right here will once again allow them to not only survive Storm, but it might also actually allow Zerg players to go back into Muta play a little bit more often. Muta play is really cool with the nerfs to the Thor that we saw already in the previous balance changes, I think Mutaplay is going to be phenomenal. So this is going to be cool. I think there's a nicer interaction right now between either going Hydras or Mutas. I'm a big fan of this change. I think it makes a lot of sense. And even though it's, once again, relatively minor, I think it's a nice quality of life improvement, because now your Hydras don't just melt to Sonic Storm, and they may actually live, which, you know, is nice. Alrighty, now here's a big one as well. I said, by the way, that we're gonna be mostly nerfs. There's a couple of good buffs here as well. You excited for them? Because these two are cool. These two are really solid. The Infestor. Infestor unit radius decreased from 0.75 to 0.625. Burrow unit radius now matches the new unburrowed unit radius. Model skill decreased from 0.85 to 0.75. Infestors can now move through units while burrowed. Fungal growth will no longer allow affected units to blink, tactical jump, or load into transport/buildings. We heard a lot of feedback that infestors feel clunky to use, so we'd like to make a few tweaks to improve their usability. We also like to give fungal growth some more of a utility by restoring some of its old functionality, allowing it to prevent certain movement abilities. The Infestor as it is right now in StarCraft is not being used very much anymore. Ever since they removed its ability to be able to cast fungal growth from burrowed, which in retrospect was kind of dumb, right? Hindsight is 20/20, but I really don't think that the unit should be able to cast fungal growth from burrowed. The thing is, when using it unburrowed, the unit is really kind of dumb at just like walking around. And in my personal judgment so far, simply just reducing the model skill size as well as the unit radius don't just allow the unit to be grouped up a lot more closely together, but also you can move them around your other units much more efficiently. Plus, when you burrow them, they can now tunnel underneath your own army, which is a big deal as well. It makes it much easier for infestors to actually get into position and to get into the battle. Now, infestors still do burrow about as quick as they can move underground, or rather they move a little bit faster when unburrowed than they do when burrowed, but it's not significantly so. So I think there's a lot of scenarios where you can be like burrowing your infestors, trying to get them into position, then pop them up and be like, surprise! You know, fungal growth everywhere, and then, you know, moving your main army and then duck underground once again with your infestors. As it is right now on the live version of StarCraft, that's very difficult to pull off because they have a hard time burrowing and just simply getting around and moving about. Now with the unit being a slight little bit smaller, as well as a little bit better at staying close together, as well as the fact that it can burrow under the rest of your army, it makes the unit way more viable, and I'm a big fan. I like this a lot. I think this is a nice little improvement. We've heard a lot of feedback that infestors feel clunky to use, so we'd like to make a few tweaks to improve their usability. We also like to give fungal growth some more utility by restoring some of its old functionality, allowing it to prevent certain movement abilities. So right now, by the way, if your units are, say for example, fungal growthing a group of blink stalkers, the stalkers are no longer going to be able to blink while they have fungal growth on them. So I don't think this is really going to affect very much of anything, but there's no denying that this is a nice quality of life change once again. So I feel like the creep and the queen nerf are very, 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 it's very important to Zerg's early game and mid game, which basically comes into play in pretty much every single one of the matchups and pretty much every single one of the games. The Roach, Hydra, Infestor changes are going to be more like quality of life changes, and in particular the Infestor one is going to hopefully make the Infestor just a little bit more viable. Here's another one. Now, in the previous episode, right, the previous video, I ranted about the Nydus Network a lot. They wanted to make the Nydus Network more viable. For example, they removed the cost of a Nydus worm from 100 minerals, 100 gas, to 50 minerals, 50 gas, which is a substantial change. However, I felt like with the reduction of it being now attackable while it's actually morphing, and while it's actually coming out of the ground, it's difficult to pull off and difficult to actually play it all together because it's still very expensive to produce. So the Nydus Network cost a decrease from 200, 250 to 150, 150. And this is a really nice, important change as well. That's actually going to allow Zerg players to now just simply put them down. We're trying to get to a point, I guess, where the Nydus Network is so cheap that Zerg players are almost forced to use it. Otherwise, they are going to be in a bad position. And I like this one a lot. Right now, you can get one tunnel as well as a Nydus Network going for 200, 200, which is the same cost of a Spire, which in the late game of Zerg versus whatever matchup is definitely viable and affordable. We received feedback that while many players like the direction of the new Nydus network, the initial cost might be a bit too high, and Nydus all-ins are sufficiently weakened now that the worm is no longer invulnerable when tunneling. Because we're also testing tuning back the Queen's transfusion ability in the same update, we'd like to see how far we can go with a Nydus network cost reduction. This is certainly one of the more experimental changes that we'd like to try out, so we'll be watching closely to how this one plays out. I'm a big fan. I like this a lot. I think it's awesome. I genuinely think that this is going to allow the Nydus network to become something that players will actually use. I've personally been trying it with Swarm Host in particular. So say, for example, my opponent is playing Terran Mech. I would put out like one worm near their 4th base, one at like the back of their main base, and then one at the 3rd. And basically I just pop the worms all over the map. Put the Swarm Hosts in there so they're actually relatively safe because they can't actually be damaged very easily. Then pop them out at a certain time. Obviously rain the Locust, put them back into the Nydus tunnel, unload them somewhere else, wait for the cooldown, rain the Locust in another direction, and it's pretty difficult for a Terran player to stay up to date with the positioning of the unit. So I think that this might very well be making that kind of play a little bit more viable, and I'm excited to give that one a try a lot more. So those are all the main changes. However, there's a couple of bug fixes as well. I just wanted to discuss this. So fix an issue that caused the attack animation of the Colossus to desync while exiting a transport. However, this one right here is interesting, the Battlecruiser. The ATA attack will now deal 5 damage instead of 8, and it will no longer be able to use its normal attack when using an ability. Also fix a typo in the Raven's anti-armor missile description. This one, though, is a big deal. So I've been playing a lot of Battlecruisers, as I mentioned, right? And I think Battlecruisers are an awesome unit. However, even with all of the buffs that they're getting, I have a really hard time pulling them off. They seem not very impressive whatsoever. One of my main gripes about the Battlecruiser is that if there's anything whatsoever on the ground, they will prioritizing attacking what is on the ground over what is fighting them from the air. So for example, I made Battlecruisers several times. I got them into like my opponent's base. A couple of Corruptors are attacking them. And the Battlecruisers literally, I'm not kidding, literally prioritize killing the larvae that are on the Zerg hatchery, or were on the Zerg's hatchery because the hatchery was destroyed. They prioritize killing larvae over actually attacking the units that are fighting it from the air. It feels like the attack priority on the Battlecruiser is really quite bad, and you have to manually micro it to hit air, which felt really backwards. And apparently, they were even dealing too much damage. So, yeah. I am not entirely sure about the Battlecruiser. I know that it's being used a little bit more in like the top-level StarCraft games. I remember watching the grand finals at the GSL Code S between TY and Maru, both Terran players, and they actually did play Battlecruisers in that game, so I thought it was exciting, but I'm not sold on it. I tried to make them work many times. If you get a whole bunch of them, they just sort of die, and I haven't really found them to be very good unless you proxy them. If you get like one of them out early game, they kind of just mess everything up for your opponent, but making the ultimate capital ship for Terran a proxy thing kind of feels bad. I wish it was like an actual solid unit that you can actually put into your unit composition if you are a Terran player. Anyways, so those are all of the changes that are made or that have been made to the balanced test map for StarCraft 2. Now keep in mind, right? While all of these changes are being made right now, these are not final. I saw a lot of people immediately jumping to conclusions. I'm sure if you read the comments on this blog post right here as well, people are probably not going to be all too happy. People are jumping to conclusions immediately that this means that Zerg and Protoss are going to be too weak and Terran is going to be too powerful. Overall, guys, you got to keep in mind that these are balanced test maps. They're still trying to figure out where this is gonna go, and by no means are these kind of things final. I know I shouldn't be saying this, but everyone should kind of be aware of it, right? But these are not the final changes. You don't have to jump to conclusions immediately. Now, I know that the best player on the planet is either currently a Zerg or a Terran. It depends on whether or not you think Serral is better or Maru. I've personally been kind of in Camp Maru over the last couple of weeks. The man is an absolute monster. And at the very least, at Montreal, Serral looked human. It looked like he could actually lose games, whereas Maru just looks absolutely unstoppable. Look, I understand. If this was the live version of StarCraft right now, I would personally also be a little bit worried, because I think that Maru would probably be unstoppable. But as it is right now, these are still very much so changes that are being tested out. So I think we are on the right track. Overall, I think these are really cool changes. I'm glad they're being tried out, and we'll see where it's gonna go in the long run. If I come up with some cool strategies or something that I think will stay in the long run, I'll make sure to make a separate video about that as well. So if you are interested in that, make sure you hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. But for now, I want to thank you for watching. Have an amazing day. Do not forget to smile alright. A special shout out to the Patreon supporters. You guys are awesome. And I hope to see you once again in the next one.